Hello and welcome to part two of our two-part BPD special of the Totally Real podcast. I'm Dylan, and I'm once again joined by my co-host, Ellen.
I am still here.
She still is. She has not escaped the basement. So in the first part, we looked at how official media tries to depict, sometimes erroneously, borderline personality disorder. This part, we're going to look at what do the fans' headcanon characters have borderline personality disorder. For those of you wondering, headcanon is when the fans of a piece of media come up with a popular fan theory or interpretation of events or characters that some of them consider to be accurate to the show, hence headcanon, it's canon in their heads. And with part one, I said we're only going to be focusing on fictional characters. Again, that rule still applies here. Only going to be focusing on characters who there seems to be some meat to the interpretation of BPD, and it's not a case of people like, oh, this character's really cool, and I have BPD, so I want this cool character to have BPD. Because I saw a few people say that, oh, Phoenix Wright from Ace Attorney is BPD because I really like those games and I have BPD. Or some people say Zuko from Avatar: The Last Airbender. Yeah, it has to be disruptive to their lives. That's kind of the criteria we're using.
Yeah, I can see that.
And the first character I want to talk about is from a very niche sci-fi series, Star Wars. We're talking about Anakin Skywalker, who, very interestingly, he was actually officially diagnosed by healthcare professionals as having borderline personality disorder. Yeah, there are peer-reviewed papers of healthcare professionals going, hey, Anakin shows 6 of the 9 signs of borderline personality disorder, we're going to diagnose him.
The number of times they must have watched the prequels, just impressive.
They justify it as expenses, like all the cinema tickets. And this was kind of done as kind of like a diagnostic aid, as like here's an example of this very niche condition, and also a way to combat the stigma around boys not having BPD, because there's a big stigma in girls are more likely to be diagnosed than boys. And also, Anakin is kind of cool, so it's something you can like talk to kids about, of like, oh, this is a disorder you have, like this cool Star Wars character, to kind of make it more relatable. And also to like keep students engaged, because everyone knows what Star Wars is, and Anakin really does show off signs of BPD, which are fear of abandonment. That is like his whole character motivation. He doesn't want to lose his mother until he does. He doesn't want to lose his wife until he does. He doesn't want to lose his unborn children. His whole motivation is him trying to avoid abandonment. We also see paranoia as he thinks Obi-Wan is coming to kill him in Revenge of the Sith. He thinks the Jedi are plotting against him. I see through the lies of the Jedi. And that leads us on to lack of identity. He's meant to be the chosen one to bring balance to the Force. But then, he joins the Sith and leaves it in darkness. The fact that he kind of flip-flops between light and dark.
He does, yeah, you're right, throughout the whole series, I guess, even when he's Darth Vader.
And well, interestingly, people very rarely point to Darth Vader as having BPD. They're kind of seen as two separate characters, and Darth Vader is kind of stoic and sort of like not very emotional, which I guess could also again reinforce that point we talked about in part one, that you can recover from BPD. Therapy works. Although I wouldn't.
Darth Vader is a success story for therapy. You heard it here first.
I wouldn't recommend murdering children and overthrowing democracy and installing a fascist dictatorship. But if that's what works for you, who am I to judge? We also see, speaking of the dark side, he has difficulty controlling his anger. Like, he kills an entire village. He kills his wife in anger. And I think this one's interesting because that does directly play a part in the story. He falls to the dark side because of his paranoia, because of his anger. And I think this is the only one where his BPD is kind of like the main driver of the plot. And a lot of people really do. People with BPD praise this idea of Anakin as having borderline personality disorder, because even though, again, he kills women and children, he kills his own wife, they go, this is what happens when we don't get treatment. This is what happens when we're left. Because throughout the prequels, he goes to the Jedi Council and is like, my guys, I'm feeling a lot of issues. Can you help? And Yoda's like, no, just don't be sad, Lamau. So it's kind of risen up as like, this is why we need help. Now onto the second character, which is Kara from Battlestar Galactica. Now, I have not watched this TV show.
Neither have I.
The main reason why I included her is because, again, I saw a few therapists who specialize in BPD pointing to her as an example. And then when I looked her up, the first line of her Wikipedia page is one of television's most complex, ever-evolving characters.
Bold claim.
Which is a bold claim, but I also thought is an interesting contrast to Anakin and some of the other characters who we see later on, who usually get accused of being poorly written.
Interesting. Yeah.
Because again, if we go back to Anakin, he has his emotional outbursts, his lack of identity, the fact that he kind of like goes so quickly to the dark side in episode 3, and people go, oh, this is like such bad character writing. He doesn't have any sense of motivation or identity, and it's like, well, no, those are signs of BPD. Usually there's this like conflation of, is it bad writing or is it borderline personality disorder? So the fact that she's seen as a very well written character is like a nice contrast.
Yeah, that's good.
And throughout the show, she first of all is a victim of parental trauma. She has like mom and dad issues from her abusive parents, which, as we talked previously, can be a cause in BPD forming. She displays abandonment issues, but in a very paradoxical way of how it's usually depicted. She will usually not commit to relationships. She will usually like break up with people, cut them off first. And I found this was really interesting because I saw people with BPD say, I can relate to her because I self-sabotage in the same way. And within these comment threads, I saw someone who didn't have BPD come in and say, no, she cuts people off way too much. She's the abandoner. People with BPD are supposed to have abandonment issues, which I think is kind of interesting that like there's the popular belief of abandonment issues is you don't want to be abandoned, when it's like, no, there's two sides of the coin. There's, you can't be fired if you quit. And also,
there's a misunderstanding of that for people without the disorder.
And also the goal of, I'm going to assume this person was a man. I have no way of knowing, but I'm very confident that they are a man because they go into a thread filled with people with borderline personality disorder saying, I relate to this, and has the goal to be like, no, I am correct. Also, throughout the show, Kara has issues of alcohol abuse, which again, impulsivity. And she also has emotional instability. So you will like, I also saw a few people discuss, just in general, not like in BPD specific forums, be like, yeah, it's a bit weird how she goes from like super happy to super angry over really small things, and I find it a bit creepy when people with BPD are like, no, this is how my emotions work. So again, we see that like disconnect between how people think BPD is and how people view it, like people with that disorder. Moving on to the next show, we have Spinel, who is the antagonist of Steven Universe Future. When I started researching this, she came up a lot.
Interesting.
So I decided to watch the film, and personally, I didn't really see it. Her main motivation is she was abandoned by the main character's mother and forced to stand still for 6,000 years, and because of that, she has abandonment issues, and she kind of wants to exact her revenge. Yeah, so it kind of feels like too rational a response. I was kind of like, okay, this just feels like she had trauma and she's coping with it, rather than BPD. And that was up until like the last 10 minutes of the show, because they resolve the conflict by having 4 characters come from off planet to be like, hey Steven, we've not heard from you, what's going on, you haven't returned our calls. They see everything's in flames and like, oh, what's going on? And he's like, oh, this woman's trying to kill me. And they go, oh, we can just adopt her, we can just take her back. And immediately her mood shifts and she's like, yeah, I'll do it. And these are kind of related to the woman who abandoned her. And she very quickly makes jokes about it. She very quickly trivializes her trauma, being like, oh, it was only 6,000 years, that's not too bad. And as someone with BPD, that's when it really clicked with me. Because our emotions like switch so often, we can kind of trivialize our own trauma, especially to fit in. So we can be more likely to stay in abusive relationships because we're like, oh, he only hit me once, or she only did this once, But also, it's like sometimes you'll be like, oh, this is a really funny joke, but then you say it and everyone's like, wait, what happened to you as a child? So the fact that she was willing to kill someone over this trauma, but then the idea of her fitting in, she immediately jokes about it, goes, oh, it's not so bad. Which is, I feel like, one aspect of BPD that doesn't get represented. Like, I'm not saying we're like comedic geniuses, but we do have a dark sense of humor that is kind of...
I've definitely heard you do that before,
kind of like unique to us. So I kind of like that. The next character is Eren Yeager from the anime Attack on Titan. Huge spoiler warning for this. I am spoiling essentially the entire story.
Oh no.
So this is like your last chance. Eren really shows some of the less sort of known about or shown off disorders of symptoms of BPD, such as turning into a giant monster and eating people. Not many people know lesser known symptom of BPD. No, he first of all, he shows off borderline thinking, which is that splitting good to bad. In a really true to life fashion. So in season 2, turns out 2 of his best friends, Berthold and Reiner, were Titans themselves and sort of orchestrated the attack that sort of killed his mother and like set the emotions of the series in play. And all the other characters are really conflicted by this. They're like, oh no, they're bad people, but they're still our friends. We still love them. How can we kill them?
Yeah.
But he immediately goes from one episode going like, I'm so glad I have these two people as friends. I know I can always rely on them, to him screaming at them saying, I will kill you. I hate you. Which I think is a really good example of like, we don't have that grey zone. As soon as we think somebody is bad, we can go straight to I hate you. We don't have that in between stage of like, oh well, maybe it's one or the other.
Yeah. Yeah.
We also see, I talked about in part one how we can like really shift our identity, like really shift our personality, because we don't have that sense of self. He does that a lot. He will really, depending on who he's with, he will really shift his personality, and that becomes a major plot point because he manages to convince his half brother that he's actually on his side, because he like completely changes his personality.
Okay.
It also shows off what is known as meta representation, which is sort of when someone with a mental illness is aware they have a mental illness and that their actions are caused by their mental illness, but are like powerless to stop it. It's like Jiminy Cricket is telling you this isn't you, this is your BPD, but you're helpless to stop it. And
fascinating.
every mental illness has this to an extent, but BPD has like the highest amount of this.
Yeah.
And in the final season, he concludes that he has to genocide the whole world to protect his friends, which, again, is borderline thinking. He's like, everyone outside the walls is bad, I'm going to kill them all.
I can see that, yeah.
But then he uses some like weird time travel shenanigans to like talk to all the people he's genociding, like with tears in his eyes, being like, I'm really, really sorry about this. Like, I don't want to do this. Which kind of shows that meta-representation. It's like he understands he's insane, but he's still doing the thing.
Right, I see that, yeah.
And again, these are like lesser known aspects of BPD that people really latched onto and are like, yeah, no, I see this. He is very quick to violence, which some people have a mixed feeling about. But I think that's like the Dennis problem, where it's like there are some aspects of an illness that are not nice, and some people just don't like not bad representation as in it's inaccurate, but like representation of the bad parts of it.
Right, the more negative sides, yeah.
I also included Eren Jaeger because Eren Jaeger has BPD, is its own AO3 tag. And every single fanfiction with this tag is just gay smut. I don't have any analysis for this. I just feel like it needed to be known.
Yeah, you put it out into the universe.
Yeah, have fun with that knowledge. Our next character is Catra from She-Ra. That's going to be fun to say drunk. And she is hands down the best depiction of BPD I have ever seen. I was actually blown away at how it wasn't canon that she has this diagnosis. As I was watching She-Ra, I had to pause it a few times and be like take a breath back. So I was like, holy shit, that is me. I cannot, like, wow, that is so me. It gets everything right. It shows favorite person, because the main character, Adora, she switches sides because they're childhood friends, they're working for the villain, but then in the first episode, the main character, Adora, switches sides and abandons her. And that sets her in turmoil. She does everything she can to get her back. But then once she realizes she isn't going to get her back, her abandonment issues go into overdrive. She cuts people off preemptively because she's like, well, you're going to leave me anyway, so why don't you F off now? She doesn't swear to kid show. And it really highlights the self-loathing and chronic feelings of emptiness we feel. It gets everything correct. The only symptoms it doesn't show is suicidality and self-harm, but this is a kids show. I doubt they could do
kind
like,
of understandable there.
Yeah, I don't think they could do like She-Ra rushes to A&E to help with an overdose. But other than that, it's the best depiction of BPD I've ever seen. And initially, I wanted to end this here and talk about how we only really see BPD in the negatives, and how there's very few positive headcanons. People are like, oh, these are positive traits of my BPD, such as being like really loyal or being like loving really deeply and latching onto that. And however, I then found out there is a positive BPD headcanon in Transformers. Quick Switch is a niche Transformers character who switches from like robot form to vehicle form based on his emotional states and has really erratic thought patterns that people with BPD really latch onto, because again he does that erratic thinking from like anger to happiness to laughter to sorrow. But people do that. It's like, oh, this is a really cool zany character. I quite like this. Is like when I'm feeling healthy, this is how my BPD manifests.
Oh, that is interesting, yeah.
So my whole original thesis about us not seeing the positivity just gone out the window.
But only in that specific case of Transformers.
Yes.
This argument is not relevant in the Transformers world.
He appears in like 2 episodes and 1 page of a comic book. It's actually quite insane that people have like really latched onto him as having BPD. But that concludes like all the fictional characters we're going to talk about today. And the one theme that I hope's like kind of jumped out at you is that the symptoms that these characters show off are very different from the canon BPD. The canon BPD focused on just impulsivity, while very few of these characters actually showed impulsivity. They showed fears of abandonment, feelings of emptiness, anger.
Yeah.
There's also a better gender balance throughout this. Although most of these characters are not human, about half of them aren't human.
Yeah. That is interesting.
And they're nearly all from sci-fi properties. When I did this research, I found nearly every character came from a sci-fi property. So there's obviously dozens of characters I've not included in this for sense of brevity,
Yeah.
which I think is interesting. I don't have analysis for this, to be honest. It's just a thing I noted. But
Yeah.
to conclude, the fact that we latch onto different symptoms than what the mainstream media sort of depicts us as is actually in line with pre-existing research on this topic. Academics have looked into how people with BPD talk about their symptoms, and they found they were really surprised. They didn't focus on the symptoms academics focus on, because academics tend to focus more on the self-harm and suicidality, because obviously those are the biggest risk of life. But to us, they're a really minor part. They're just another tool in our way to cope with different issues, because as I said in part 1, our relationship with self-harm is really different. While other disorders will usually do it because they're feeling overwhelmingly sad or they feel numb and they want to feel something, for people with BPD, it's usually a grounding mechanism. It's usually like our emotions are out of control. Either I'm like really sad, or even sometimes like you're so happy that you can't think straight that you need to like literally let the emotions like bleed out. It's not a healthy way of dealing with it, but it's very different to like depression or
it does sound very different.
other types. So I think it's quite interesting that there's that big gap between how people without BPD depict it versus what depictions people with BPD are drawn to. So that's everything for this 2-part special. Hope you enjoyed this episode of the Totally Real podcast, and I hope you tune in to the next episode. Goodbye.
Goodbye.